Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Nicholas Wolf. I'm the acting director of Fluxman Ireland House, while our normal director, Kevin Kenny, is on leave. So it's my pleasure to be here tonight. We are one of the stops on the whistle stop tour, shall we say, for the launching of Dr. Ciara O'Dowd's Wild Looking But Fine Abbey Theatre Actresses of the 1930s, now out on University College Dublin Press. Always pleased to see such wonderful books coming out of UCD Press. Now, before we get to the main event, let me offer you a look ahead to our public events as we make our way more deeply into the fall season. First of all, if you looked ahead on our calendar, please don't be alarmed. We do have a slight gap here of a few weeks while we focus on some other things. So we'll have our next big event on November 14th. But in the meantime, if you are in any way interested in our MA program, October 17th coming up in a week is our open house. It's going to be on Zoom. But if you want to learn about our Irish Studies program, our MA program, that is the time to learn about it. So anyway, after a few weeks hiatus, of course, we have October's big Halloween events and all sorts of things that keep my kids busy. We'll be back on November 14th with the launch of Paige Reynolds' new book, Modernism in Irish Women's Contemporary Writing. So that promises to be yet another wonderful launch. That following Saturday, the 16th, if you've ever been interested in learning the Irish language, please come to Law Gaeilge, all right? So this is our opportunity, our free option for you if you're in the city to come join us and learn at the beginner, intermediate, advanced level. If you've learned Irish a little bit before and want to polish it up, this is your chance to do that. All levels of learner are welcome on that day on Saturday, so please come by. Now, for tonight's event, we will have, please stick around after our wonderful discussion here for some food and drink downstairs. Now is a good time to silence your cell phones if those are at hand and potentially are a difficulty for us. Other than that, tonight we are joined by Dr. O'Dowd to launch a book addressing the missing histories of actors Aideen O'Connor and Mooney, members of the Abbey Theatre Company, who performed in Dublin and the United States in the 1920s and 1930s. I'm very excited about this book. If any of you have spent any time in theater archives, you know, they are the most amazing things, right? A mix of, sketches of theater scenes, photographs, captures of original performances, sometimes the very first performance has been ever given of a production. You know, they are amazing. And what we learn here from this book is the opportunities that arise when you travel and visit various archives and pull those together into one particular narrative. So I'm very much looking forward to reading this book. Dr. O'Dowd, our guest, trained at Trinity College Dublin and the University of Galway, spent 10 years as a theater assessor and advisor for the Arts Council of Ireland, and now works as a consultant in the nonprofit and cultural sector. Among her key contributions is the groundbreaking report, Gender Counts, an analysis of gender in Irish theater, 2006 to 2015. I know I've seen this in footnotes. It is something that has been referenced many times. And her publications have appeared in journals New Hibernian Review, Critical Stages, Theater Topics, and the literary magazine, Banshee Magazine. So Dr. O'Dowd tonight will be in conversation with our very own Caroline Hafey, Assistant Director of Fluxman Ireland House. And so I turn it over to you, Caroline.
Thanks so much, Nick. And thank you to all of you who are here this evening. And a special thank you and welcome to Noelle Moran from UCD Press, who's here. We're delighted to have our friends from across the pond joining us for this launch this evening. And thank you to Ciara. Thank you for coming all the way and letting us talk with you about this beautiful book.
Thank you for having me. And it's wonderful to be here on a program like this in Glucksman House. But also to bring them back to New York. I think to bring the women back to New York where they did spend time in the 20s and 30s is really special and quite emotional for me. So it's lovely to be here.
And I please get your copy of this book on the way out. It's gorgeous, and we're only going to kind of brush the surface of all it contains. But in the meantime, the book looks at the life stories of primarily two women who have kind of been lost to the kind of social consciousness of the last few decades. Could you maybe give us a little bit of context for who they were and what compelled the project?
I suppose just to give a little bit of background, we were speaking earlier to the Abbey Theatre and its place in Ireland. It's quite unique. It was the first state subsidized theatre in the English-speaking world. And it was started in 1904, but in the 1920s, the Minister of Finance gave the Abbey Theatre a subsidy. And that meant that it was given a place in society as a place to, the mission of the theatre at the time was to play out the emotions, the deeper emotions of Ireland on the stage of the National Theatre. So it had quite a unique space. And the women that you can see here joined the company in the kind of 1910s, 1920s. And it was to get a place in the Abbey Company was seen as a very respectable position and very important position for an actor. Unlike maybe other women at the time who might have been in music hall or other popular entertainments, it was a very important role to have. So the women that the book is focused on is the woman in the center here, you can see in costume, in the dressing costume. And I believe this was taken in 1933, before her first appearance at the Abbey. She had just turned 20 and she had come through the Abbey school. She had learned elocution and deportment at their lessons, and she was given a place in the company at that time. The woman on this side here is an actor called Frawley Mulhern. She was born in Enniskillen around 1907, and she was from a very wealthy family there. But when she was young, her father passed away, and her mother brought 7 children to Aylesbury Road in Dublin, which was a very salubrious address in Dublin at the time. And she was a bit, from what I've heard, a bit of a misfit in the family. She was an incredible mimic, wonderful comedian, and she, like Aideen, would have joined the company, and they became very good friends. And Frawley was actually born with a heart defect, and her mother knew that from quite an early age. So when they started traveling in the 20s and 30s, it always occurs to me that her family knew how dangerous that was for her, but they let her go. And on this side here with the gentleman, I don't know if anybody recognizes the gentleman who knows Irish theatre, it's Sean O'Casey, it's the playwright Sean O'Casey. And this is Ria Mooney appearing as Rosie Redmond. She was the first woman to play Rosie in The Plough and the Stars, which was the first prostitute to appear on the stage at the Abbey Theatre. And this picture, I'll show you in more detail one of it later on, but it's actually inscribed and signed from Sean to Ria, thanking her, I suppose, in effect, for taking the role, which at the time was considered quite a dangerous part to play. And on the other side here is Aideen O'Connor later on in her career. So she joined the Abbey in the 30s and went on to travel with them in the States. And she went on to be in a relationship with Arthur Shields, who's another well-known film actor who was the brother of Barry Fitzgerald. And Aideen traveled with Arthur to New York in 1939. She was here when war broke out. And after that, Arthur got TB here in the city and was hospitalized in Lenox Hill. And he was advised at that point to travel to California because of the weather. So Barry and Arthur drove from here across to California, and Aideen followed on a train from Grand Central Station. And she lived out the rest of her life in Hollywood with Arthur and Barry.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And you've brought these gorgeous slides. Maybe we could go through some of the photos to begin.
Again, sorry, these are pictures again of Aideen and Frawley. I've just spoken about them, so you can, keep going. And this picture here is very special. I've never shown this before, actually, and I couldn't publish it in the book because it's from a private collection. So the lovely thing about these small groups is that I can show it. And this is Aideen on the rooftop of an apartment building in California not long after they arrived there. And this is another still of Ria Mooney later in life, which I think was taken in the studios. They were taking shots of the women with the possibility that they might actually get cast in films. So that was one of those shots. And this, we spoke about this this afternoon. It's just, and it's a piece of history, I suppose, and much of the joy of working with archives, as you know, is that tactile feeling of actually touching something that has lasted and that, you know, belonged to somebody else. And this is a postcard that came in 1933 to Aideen's house in Ranelagh. And it was inviting her to come to the theatre to see Mr. Arthur Shields. So it was effectively an invitation to join the company. She was just 20, just out of the School of Acting. And of course, Arthur Shields would go on to become her husband, which is why it's so emotional. But written across it, I don't know if you can read the Irish there for any Irish speakers, but it says, Ganairi an Tálat, Daddy. And so her father had wished her luck in Irish and signed it off. And she carried this with her. Aideen's story did not have a happy ending, I suppose, in a lot of ways. And not long after she got into a relationship with Arthur Shields, she was put out of the house, essentially. Her father never spoke to her again. And she died without actually reconciling with her father. But she kept this with her all those years. And it was in her personal collection in California that came back to the archive in Galway. So it's a special one for me.
Heart-wrenching, really. And Arthur Shields, too. I mean, for anyone who might not, you know, was in The Quiet Man, became kind of an A-list celebrity of his day. But I also like to note that he also participated in the 1916 Easter Rising. So, you know, quite a character in and of himself, but yeah.
And he was, of course, the brother of Barry Fitzgerald, who was Will Shields, essentially was his name, became Barry Fitzgerald. And Barry Fitzgerald lived in the back garden, essentially, of Arthur and Aideen's house in Hollywood.
Very tight-knit Irish group in Hollywood.
Yes. And this is a later photo of Ria Mooney, I think probably from the 1940s. So Ria came back to Ireland in the 1940s, worked in a number of different positions, but essentially became, in 1944, she became, the title was Director of Plays in English at the Abbey Theatre. It was essentially the artistic director position. And there's been quite a bit of debate over this, over whether it was, she wasn't giving it because she was a woman, or whether it was just that the title actually didn't exist at the time. The theatre had become a kind of bastion of the Irish language. Blythe, who'd taken over, had described the theatre as being a line of military defense. And so the title didn't exist. So she became Director of Plays in English, which essentially allowed her in a lot of ways to try experimenting and making new work. And so she was known from that time as a very innovative theatre director. And yeah, this is the image that we were talking about that was signed by Sean O'Casey. You can see it says, be clever, my girl, and let who will be good. And it was signed by him in January 1926.
What age there?
She is 26. She's in her 20s. Yeah. So
Very young.
Very young, very young. And the play was quite incendiary in Dublin at the time. There's been a lot written about that first production. But there's a lot about Ria at that time as well. The story in the Abbey was that Ria didn't know what a prostitute was. And so but what she actually did when Sean O'Casey asked for her to have the role, and she decided to find out more about these women. And she was known for going down, as they said, literally down the back alleys of the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, which at the time was part of the Monto, it's called in Dublin. It was a really dangerous and kind of unsalubrious place to be, but she spoke to the women down there, and she wanted to understand I suppose, how they felt and what they thought. And she copied their clothes. It's quite unusual. You know, when I show this to students, they always say, you know, she was a prostitute, you know, this kind of, that there's nothing, you know, what we would consider today as kind of racy or promiscuous, but so she has this kind of blanket and the white top, but she made her face up to match the prostitutes that she had seen in the Monto, and it was considered incredibly controversial at the time.
And risky to be, you know, making those decisions at such a young age too, very new to theater, very new to the Abbey.
Absolutely. And that story is always told that Rhea didn't know what a prostitute was. And I mean, I talk about this in the book. I don't believe that's true. I think she did know what a prostitute was, but I think she wasn't in a position to tell people that she knew what a prostitute was. And other women who appeared in The Plough and the Stars, who didn't have, you know, roles anywhere as controversial, publicly announced that they had gone to their father confessor or to the Catholic priest to get dispensation to appear in this play. Rhea didn't have a father confessor, she says. So yeah, it was quite a strong move for her at that time. And she didn't stay in the Abbey much longer after that role. I think she felt herself that, you know, it was an uncomfortable place for her to be from then on. And it was not long after that that she left for New York. Yeah. And this is the company, I believe, that were in New York in 1938. And the tour of 1938 is the central part of my book, the central kind of spine of it, because they came here in September 1938. They were in the Hotel Edison, just off Times Square. And they were there for almost months, I think, in the Hotel Edison before they left for the West Coast. There was some controversy over the funding for the tour and whether they were going to be able to go. And so I believe this picture was taken there at the time. You can see Arthur Shields on the right-hand side here. Aideen is beside him. This is F.J. McCormack, who was really well known at the time. And that's his wife in the center, in the dress. And they were a married couple in the Abbey Company who were known as kind of almost the Alfred Lunt and Joan Fontaine, I don't know if you, which were the kind of American reference of the time, who were you know, a very well-known married couple who appeared, and Eileen and F.J. McCormack kind of modeled themselves on that. They always toured together, they performed together, they performed husband and wife together much of the time. And this is Froley Mulhern, just in from the right-hand side there. The one who's missing from that picture is Rhea Mooney. And we spoke about this earlier, because when they landed in New York in 1938, according to various sources, Rhea took sick, took to her bed in the Hotel Edison. And I've done quite a bit of kind of exploration of that, because I don't believe it was just a physical illness. I think coming back to New York at that time, the kind of insecurities she'd had here earlier, and all of those kind of issues came back to haunt her. And so she's missing from that picture, but I think it gives a good sense of the joy and excitement that was happening in the Hotel Edison, the fun they were having at the very same time, as we talked about today, as the 1937 Constitution was being brought in Ireland.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I have this kind of juxtaposition, which I think is so interesting. You know, there's one, I think one moment in the book where Aideen O'Connor is, you know, she's going out a lot. They're having lots of fun. They're going out on the town, such that at one point they say, oh, well, sure, it doesn't make sense to go to bed. We might as well just go to mass now, you know, on Sunday morning at 4 a.m.
Yeah.
So there's that going on. And then also across at home, the 1937 Constitution is effectively legislating women out of the workforce, right? So for these women to be on tour abroad as respectable actresses in New York, having, you know, traveled by boat to get here, I think that that's just sort of a fascinating context to be thinking about what's going on in this photo, and juxtaposed with home. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an unusual situation. I think you always have to think about the Abbey Theatre actresses as being in a very particular position. You know, as I spoke about before, it was considered a respectable position. And at the same time, they were like one of the few groups of women in Ireland at the time who could actually earn their own money, support themselves. They were traveling, they were meeting and mixing, you know, with seeing the kind of influences that most women in Ireland wouldn't be able to. But at the same time, there you can see all at various points the kind of the conservative boundaries that were at play all the time. And I mean, the going to 4 a.m. mass is one element of that, but it was that sense that they could almost operate a little bit under the radar, I think, as actors, but they couldn't publicly present as transgressing those boundaries in any kind of meaningful way. The acting tradition in the Abbey Company kind of evolved out of an almost amateur kind of at-home situation, which were at homes were kind of evenings in respectable homes where people would get up and take a turn, essentially. So tell a story or sing a song or whatever it was. And
Party piece.
Yes.
Do the party piece.
Do the party piece. And Abbey acting came out of that same tradition. And so I think there was a sense for audiences attending the Abbey in the 30s that you went to see somebody you knew and somebody you considered as respectable and presenting a part. So Eileen Crowe could do, you know, Nora from A Doll's House or roles like that because it was Eileen Crowe. And there was kind of a double visioning going on. And I think what happened with these women was that they were much more interested in acting as embodying or taking on the roles, understanding these women and becoming these women, and expressing that in acting that was quite physical as well. So they were really interested in physicality and how a woman like that prostitute might move or shape, and that's when things started to get dangerous, I think, for them.
And you talk a little bit about in the book how the kind of the previous generation, the elder generation of Abbey actresses especially, sort of thought that some of this behavior was somewhat uncouth or that maybe they were pushing the boundaries a little bit too much. So how did that kind of play out for the rest of the tour?
I mean, it played out in a number of ways. It was playing out on stage, I think, in terms of Eileen Crowe and some of the others were taking issue with the way in which the women were embodying these parts. It was playing out socially, in that Arthur Shields had been married and had a child, and the relationship had broken down. And he started a relationship with Aideen, but somebody in the company sent a letter to her father saying what was going on in the theater, and the same person sent a letter to his wife telling them that they were on. So they were quite literally policing their behavior in very stringent ways. And I think that comes up on tour as well. While they were able to socialize and mix and all that, there was a sense that, yeah, they still had to present, and they did present. The American newspapers at the time described them as, you know, these lovely colleens and these, you know, respectable women. But the detail of their own personal lives at the time suggests there was something else going on.
Very intriguing. Do we want to look at maybe the rest of the photos? Or?
Yeah, this is Aideen on stage again in, I think, another Sean O'Casey. I think it's probably Mary Boyle in Shadow of a Gunman. And you can see she was tiny and quite the kind of female ingenue, I think, at that point. And this is Ria Mooney here this was a 1930s play called Parnell of Avondale, which was a play written at the time about Charles Stewart Parnell, another major figure in Irish history. And again, as part of that, Ria went to Avondale in Wicklow and spoke to the women the sisters of Parnell, who at that stage were quite advanced in age. But again, there was that sense that she was really interested in getting to know these people and what was going on underneath. But I think what I love about this picture is you get a real sense of the Abbey at that time, and it wasn't a very what we say salubrious theatre at the time. And there was a lot of kind of makeshift stuff going on. It had its moments in terms of scene design and that, but there was still an element of, and Ria had said this herself, that, you know, when you were served food on the Abbey stage, it was paper ham and wooden cutlets of you know, wood cut out in the shape of pork chops. And so it always strikes me, she then came to 14th Street when she came here, and she worked with the Civic Repertory Company and Le Gallienne's company here. And Le Gallienne was known for the opposite, which was this really luxurious dressing of plays. So, and they used to have warmed Chianti on the stage and ragu and all of, and Ria went from one to the other and then back to the Abbey. And she says, later on she said, which I always think is a lovely story, she talks about how much she learned from Le Gallienne and that incredible immersion and the Chianti on the stage. But she says she had never actually been as drunk as when she'd had lemonade on the Abbey stage the first time she appeared. So there was that sense of imagination that she never let go of, I think.
Very good. It must have been a rude awakening going back after.
I don't know how she did it, yeah. And I mean, she wasn't, it has to be said, she wasn't happy there towards the end of her life, but yeah. And this is another picture actually from that tour, and it's a play called The Far Off Hills, which was a Lennox Robinson play. It was a huge hit at the time. It's amazing, and it's been performed once, maybe twice, I'd say, in the last 30 or 40 years in Dublin. And it's a pity because it's actually a great play. But what you see here are Aideen and Frawley in the two beds. And they were, at that stage, Aideen was in her 20s, Frawley was in her 30s, and they're playing teenage girls. And again, that was kind of a part of a feature of Abbey acting at the time, that they were playing much older. And over their shoulders are Maureen Delaney, who was also a well-known comedienne at the time, and Eileen Crowe on this side as well. So I always think there's something about this picture in that it captures much of what we've talked about in terms of what was personally going on in the company, and these two kind of maternal figures who saw it as their role to keep these young women in line, I think, as they toured. And this picture was taken in Paramount Studios in 1938. So when the Abbey got eventually to the West Coast, it was with the help of this gentleman just here in the tie on the left-hand side, who is Albert Wicks. And a huge part of the archives in the book, I think you'll have known, are Wicks's papers. And he was a theater impresario from Boston. But he took a shine to the Abbey Theatre Company and was really supportive. And in fact, I ended up traveling to, he emerged, and I say this in the book, I was researching in the National Library in Dublin, Abbey records, and they all talked about Albert Wicks, and he became this kind of character in the letters, and how much fun he was, and how clever he was, and how smart he was with money. And I decided to find out more about him, but it ended up taking me to Claremont, California, which was a strange kind of loop. And there were these incredible records, and they were essentially business records. But as I've discovered in archives, sometimes the information you want is in the most unlikely places. And I discovered that, in effect, Albert Wicks turned that tour around. When the Abbey Theatre were in New York, the reason they stayed here for so long was they ran out of money. The shows were not popular, they were not selling, and there was a real fear that they were going to have to go home. And Albert kind of turned it around. Fred Higgins, who was an Irish board member from the Abbey, who was with them, essentially handed it over to Albert Wicks. He couldn't manage anymore. And Wicks set off for the West Coast, and they ended up in Paramount Studios. And it was as a result of that kind of connection that those kind of film careers started. So the film of The Plough and the Stars, The Quiet Man, all came from, I think, this original connection. And this sorry, this is a strange photo to share here, but I just thought it was important to talk about. This is Christine, who is the daughter of Aideen and of Arthur Shields. And I was lucky enough to get to go to California and to go with Christine to Museo Frank's, which is a restaurant off Hollywood Boulevard. And it was Aideen and Arthur's favorite restaurant. And it was actually only a couple of blocks from where they were living at the time. And Christine doesn't remember her mom. She was three and a half when she passed away. But she was essentially the holder of the archive before it came to Galway. And she had an incredible collection of papers belonging to Barry Fitzgerald, to Arthur Shields, and by extension to Aideen. And so when I went to California, I arranged to meet her, but she became a huge part of the story in terms of she knew so little about her mom, and she became, you know, she was also incredibly smart at figuring out ways to get information, including archival information. And so we went on quite the hunt around California, but she was a huge part of the story.
I think sometimes there can be this misconception when we talk about archival work that when you go into an archive, you know, you're just going to find the information that you're looking for, and it's this very tidy, you know, Dewey Decimal System organized thing. And that's just never the case, actually. So could you tell us a little bit about, you know, what the archival work for this book was like?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. I always say it's a bit like, you know, a treasure map, but there is actually no X on it, and you kind of wander around a lot. When I originally when it came upon the Shields archive, I was incredibly lucky or fortunate in that it had literally just arrived from California in the university in Galway, and it wasn't catalogued or listed in any way. I'm not even sure I should have been in there, to be honest, but it meant that when I pulled things out of the archive, I was getting it in no particular order. And so the first thing I got were letters from Aideen about New York, which, you know, just fascinated me. And the second thing I got was her death certificate. And I knew then that she had died at 37 and that the ending hadn't been well. And so I became obsessed with finding a way to tell that story. But it became then about those kind of strange connections and moments and names that turn up in them. And I was traveling at one point and I blogged about Ria. And a friend of my mother's was reading the blog, not because she had any interest in theatre, but just to check where I was. And a few days later, she went into a charity shop and she picked up a novel. And the novel turned out to be a very lightly fictionalized autobiography of a woman called Lillian Finlay, who had actually been trained by Ria and who had incredible memories of Ria. And I blogged about that book, and her family, Lillian Finlay's family, actually reached out and said, "Thank you for the piece, but also we have a milk tray box full of letters. Would you like them?"
Jackpot.
Jackpot. And they were kind enough to hand them over. And so, you know, it was this incredible archive of letters, which they didn't know what to do with because their mother had trained as an actor, had never really made it. And so no library wanted them, no archive wanted them, but they were absolute gold dust to me.
Wonderful. Are there any other photos left? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, this is the grave in California that we went to visit. Yeah, so she died in 1950. Arthur Shields and Barry Fitzgerald both are buried in Dean's Grange in Dublin, close to where they grew up. And so Aideen's grave is in California on her own, which always kind of broke my heart a bit, but yeah.
There's so much to cover here, especially between the life stories of these two women. I'm going to ask a kind of obvious question at first, which is, why write this book? Why write the life stories of these two women in particular? I think sometimes that question gets asked in a challenging way. You know, why do these stories deserve to be told? But I think from conversations with you, I know that they're, we can become quite attached to these life stories. So I wonder if you could kind of talk about that and that experience.
Sure. I mean, I think when I'm being facetious, when somebody asks me that, I always say I didn't choose them, they chose me. Because I've definitely had a sense of that this story was being kept and the archives were being passed down for something at some point. I think on the other side, I suppose as a writer, I think failure is infinitely more interesting to write about than success, actually. And I'm not sure why that is, but I just think this sense of these women who had made a bid for something that was just out of reach for women at that time is something that really, really interests me. And I mean, my original PhD focused on a much kind of wider scope of women in that company, and some of them like Eileen Crowe and May Craig, who went on to act into their 70s and 80s and quite successfully, and raised families in Dublin and were very successful. But these women were, I think, reaching for something in terms of both their acting style and their sense of theatre, but also in their own lives that at that period in Irish history just wasn't possible. But that to me is much more interesting.
Absolutely. I think sometimes when working on these kind of excavation, we've talked about this, but working on kind of excavational or recovery projects, there's a desire for the subject to kind of fit what you want them to have been, right? What you want, or what the preconceptions that you bring to the project. And then at a certain point, you kind of have to let those go and they guide you through the story, right? I wonder, a lot of what you talk about in the book, in a way, it's a history of these women, but it's also a history of the Abbey. What's that been like? What's the relationship with the Abbey to the book and to these women?
I mean, the Abbey, thankfully, have been very supportive of the book and of the thing. There's been quite a project in Ireland, I suppose, over the last number of years to digitize the records in the Abbey. There's a huge amount of information there. Excuse me. And so they're, I think, are very happy to see these stories coming out. The Abbey is and continues to be a contentious feature of Irish society, I think, which we have talked about before. So as I said, it was the first theatre to get a state subsidy, and that continues to be the case in that the Abbey is funded mainly by the state. At this point, it's getting a subsidy of about 8 million a year, and that's more than 50% of the Arts Council of Ireland's theatre budget. So all of that money is going in one place. And it's a stage which has to negotiate and set up and portray, as I said, still the emotions and our deeper emotions of the country, in terms of it is always dealing with how we want to present ourselves, how we are presenting ourselves. And those national questions is very much still at the center of the Abbey's work. And so I think anything that enriches and complicates that history is a good thing. And thankfully they have taken this book and these stories in the same way.
Some folks here might know that in 2016, that was a particularly, I don't know, challenging might not be the right word, but it was a momentous time for the Abbey and for theatre in Ireland in general. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and your work in Waking the Feminists?
So they were celebrating the centenary of the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, and there was a big announcement about the programme for the year, which there had been a lot of discussion and debate over what should be staged during that year to mark the centenary of the theatre, but also all the pieces of history that had happened, including 1916, including all of those developments. And when the programme was announced, it was noted that there were no female playwrights on that programme. And it sparked a discussion, which became a debate, which became a social media movement, I suppose, by women. And it was titled very quickly Waking the Feminists because the program was called Waking the Nation. So that's where the title came from. But a group of activists, all very established, esteemed theatre people in Dublin, got together and said, we've had enough. We're not letting this happen again. And it took on a life of its own. And I think it was part of a wider movement, I think, around the world in terms of kind of gender equality. But something about, I think, the size of Ireland and the importance of the Abbey seemed to just ignite the whole debate in Dublin. There were a number of large meetings in Dublin. There were chapters set up around the world, including here in New York, which Caroline was aware of, to kind of support the work and to make things happen. And as part of that, the activists, we were all saying, we know that, women are not being given the same stages and the same roles in theatre as the men. And it was being said, well, you don't, that's anecdotal and you don't know that and you can't prove that. And so the activists decided that they would prove it. And so a small group of academics in the area came together, and we essentially looked at the last 10 years in Irish theatre, 2006, 2015. We looked at the top 10 funded companies because the state does fund theatre companies in Ireland. And we calculated the gender quotas, and we were invited back by the Abbey, which was the most wonderful part of the whole thing. So we were invited back by the Abbey to present the results of that on the Abbey stage. And the outcome of the report was that the more funding you got from the state in Ireland, the less likely that your company was gender balanced.
And on that, I actually have a quote here from Anne Enright, Irish writer Anne Enright, who she said about Waking the Feminist, she said, in 2016, I learned the power of counting because numbers are factual and the facts don't lie or feel sorry for themselves or quote Yeats back at you or wish or wish you were more like their mother or less like their mother. So I think, yeah, just having that hard data became really, really challenging to confront, but also to argue with, right? And then also, having stories like this, there's a way in which this is hard data, but it's a story, right? And it's told through your perspective in the archives, and you very much include yourself in the narrative, right? You talk about, you use first person narration to talk about navigating the archives and navigating these stories. So I wonder, what does that mean for these kinds of projects where we are looking at identities that have been historically marginalized? How do we kind of recreate archives or consider what archives might be lacking, but also how we might reimagine them?
Sorry, just as a coda to that, Anne Enright was a wonderful supporter of Waking the Feminists at the time, but and we did speak to her about the fact that while, numbers are factual, we did have a number of conversations with men during that time telling us how to count. But that's a whole other story. Yeah, I think the personal narrative is very important to me in terms of, I don't think any biographer can separate themselves from the subject and the story. And so to me, it was important to accept that and to try and negotiate that and present that without, without pretending to be objective, when that's a really difficult thing to be.
Absolutely. How are we doing on time, by the way? We're okay? Oh, okay. Maybe with that, we can open it up to some questions from the audience. I feel like we've been chatting a lot, but if folks have questions about the book, about the women, about anything that we've been discussing.
Thank you for a very informative talk. I really liked it. Getting to the Abbey and the fact that it's state funded and still state funded, a lot of S's. If there is a controversial play right now, and the director said, do I go to the Abbey and take a chance, or do I go to the Druid? In other words, is the Druid the one that can run with the dicey plays or the plays that might, you know, go over a cliff?
Yeah, it's a really interesting comparison, and it's really interesting that you bring up Druid as being central to that. Druid, yes, I think yes. Firstly, in that I think the Abbey is also always negotiating itself as that kind of a representation of Ireland. At the same time, Druid has a very particular mission in its presentation of work, particularly from the west of Ireland. So while in later years it has done O'Casey and those other plays, its focus tends to be on Tom Murphy and on the kind of Western canon. I think the other theatre, which we didn't speak about, is the Gate Theatre, which has a similarly long history to the Abbey, although it's never received the same amount of funding. And since its inception kind of in the 1920s, so the Gate Theatre, for those who don't know, was a theatre literally at the other end of O'Connell Street. But it was founded and run by Micheál MacLeamore and Hilton Edwards, who were a gay couple who started the theatre as a way of presenting more European and controversial work. And so I think the Gate now is more in that space of pushing the boundaries and then showing us more contemporary work. There's been a number of American plays there recently. But Druid is also presenting new work, but it tends to be more in its particular mode, I suppose. So yeah, it's interesting to see that there are also younger companies coming through. But again, it can be hard to compete from a funding perspective, and that often does define the type of work that they're doing.
Irish Art Center, 2 years ago, I think it was, they had a play that was fabulous, and it was a Dublin company. Chekhov's
last play.
Yeah, I saw that 3 times. I couldn't get over it. The production and everything about that was perfect. What is the name of the company again?
So the company is
The
called,
Dead.
they're called Dead Center. And it's, again, that's a company from Dublin, one English, one Dublin director that began making work. Much of their work, again, it's a question in Dublin, most of their work actually premieres in Germany, in Berlin, and they've kind of, they're funded by Culture Ireland, but a lot of their work starts there. And they've really started to push Irish theatre in terms of its form and its shape, which is really, really, really exciting. And if I can give another really strange link, which is that the artistic director of Dead Center is now married to another theatre artist called Lauren Jones, who in fact is the great, great, great niece of Barry Fitzgerald and Arthur Shields. So, so that tradition still continues, but yeah.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and this book seems really wonderful and interesting. I apologize to everyone else because this may be only an interest of mine, but I'm wondering if you ran across in your research the actress Mary Manning and what her, I mean, I know that she studied with Sarah Allgood at the Abbey and was a close friend of Samuel Beckett's and was a playwright.
Yeah, a really, really fascinating woman. And she did turn up in my research, and I went down a rabbit hole for quite a bit of time looking at her work. So she's a little bit before this company. And again, she primarily appeared in the Gate Theatre, and which, as I was saying, was that kind of more European experimental theatre at that time in the 1920s. But she actually was an understudy for Ria Mooney. And this is where, you know, Dublin is small and they all start to intersect and cross over. So Mary Manning and Ria Mooney would have traveled to the UK together in the 1920s. in Sean O'Casey. So Mary Manning was doing experimental work in the Gate, but was then also, I suppose, paying the bills essentially by appearing in O'Casey in the UK. And Rhea would have been her understudy, and they then came to America. And she did have an ongoing correspondence with Rhea Mooney. There are some letters between them from later in their lives. But I forget exactly where she ended up, but she's in Boston. Yeah, and she's still in Boston, I think. Yes, yeah. But her family are in yeah. Yes, that's right. Yes, yeah. And it is that incredible thing, I think, in the Irish theatre tradition, where you can see these people like Mary Manning, who, as you say, worked with Beckett, worked with Hilton and MacLeamore, and then this kind of ongoing connection with, writers of today, and that kind of family tradition is really important. So yes, she was also a friend of Sheila Richards, I think, and would have been in New York with her in the 1920s. So yeah, they all cross paths. And it's funny sometimes to see, you can't always tell who was friends with who and who had actually disagreed with who, but they all knew each other for sure. Yeah, I don't think so. I think they were just before, but it's really interesting. So when Rhea came in the 1920s, she came to the Civic Repertory, to Eva Le Gallienne's company. And that's where she got much of her training. And there's a really interesting connection with New York in terms of Le Gallienne took Rhea on because she saw a similarity between the Abbey style of acting and what she was doing here in New York. And there were an awful lot of differences, but there was a similarity in terms of the stylistic elements to it. So I think they were just before that, the group theatre, but it will be really interesting to see. Much of Rhea's letters and diaries from that time in New York talk about the work that she was seeing. And I mean, it's quite incredible that these women were seeing this kind of work, which was so far away from what was happening in Ireland at the time, but had a profound effect on what they were doing on the stage. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, I said this at the event in Dublin, and it's never been said before, but Rhea Mooney is the connection between Stanislavski and the Abbey Theatre. And that's through Le Gallienne. So Le Gallienne was schooled in the Stanislavski and the Moscow Arts Theatre, and the Abbey styled itself on that kind of movement. But Rhea is the thread, I think, from that style of acting through to the Abbey today, which is incredible for me still to think about. Yeah.
Said that Rhea wrote with Samuel Beckett, right?
Sorry?
Oh, did you say that Rhea wrote with Samuel Beckett?
No, so Mary Manning would have worked with Samuel Beckett in the 1920s.
Okay, never mind. Sorry.
I remember during COVID, one plus of COVID was internationally there were screenings of theater, and one was again a play. I think it was called On the Bridge. Do you know what was that the Druid or the Gate? That was fabulous. Three person monologue, but I've never seen it done so gorgeously. And then the ending, die for.
Yeah. So, and again, it's a really interesting link again, in that Druid, who are known for, as I was saying, the kind of Western canon. Tom Murphy took on Sonia Kelly, who is a young and upcoming Dublin writer, and who recently received I'm going to forget the title of it, the Yale playwrights, the big playwrights award, a huge amount of money. The title of it is gone. And yeah, so and it's a life-changing amount of money from Yale, which will allow her just to write and do nothing else for the next 2 years. And that's really exciting that she has Druid behind her and she's doing other work. But yeah.
Can you tell us about the title of the book?
Sure. I always say this book had a number of different titles. Right? So, and the first one was actually the title of my PhD, which was the on and off stage roles of Abbey Theatre actresses in the 1930s, which probably captures kind of what they were. The second title was a quote from Yeats, but it was actually a quote from George Yeats rather than W.B. Yeats. So George Yeats wrote to her husband in London in the 1930s, and Aideen had been put out of her house and she had gone to stay in Howth with Hugh Hunt, who was the artistic director of the time. And he wasn't there, but he had said she could stay in her house. She needed somewhere to live. And she was reported by the housekeeper to the parish priest for being on her own in the house. And George called them those poor innocent girls. And it always struck me as a great title in that it wasn't, it was George Yeats's depiction of what they were, even though now looking back, I don't think George Yeats had a very happy marriage or a happy life. But and then I settled on, so While Looking But Fine is the character description from the Playboy of the Western World. It's the character description for Peggy and Mike in the opening section. And I think Singh uses it to describe a woman who is unkempt, who is a bit earthy and has just come in from the outside, you know, where she's been building walls or something, but is essentially, you know, a good-looking woman in that kind of While Looking But Fine. But I really like the potential for it to be read in a contemporary way as like Irish women being fine, because I think it's something that women say a lot, you know, they're working and raising children and, you know, trying to be creative and all of these wonderful things. And we just say we're fine. And so that's ultimately where it ended. And I have to thank UCD Press and Noel for being part of that final decision, because it went around, the titles went around for quite a while.
Well, if there are no other questions, I think we could potentially continue this conversation downstairs. Please pick up your copy of this beautiful book. And I think Ciara has agreed to sign some for anyone who might be interested. So thank you, Ciara. Thank you for being here. Thanks to UCD Press, and thank you all for coming. This was great.